Thank you very much for joining. Welcome to our first People Matter webinar in a series of 3 about redundancy. So let me take you through some stuff. Housekeeping first. This session is being recorded. The Q&A is enabled if you'd like to ask us some questions. There will be a feedback form at the end, and we're going to take you through 5 things to get right from a redundancy perspective. So I'm James Kidd, I'm a partner, and I happen to be in our Norwich office, and I'm joined by...
I'm Kate Watkins, and I happen to be in our Birmingham office.
So we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about in a second, but as a teaser for what is to come. So this is a series of 3 webinars on redundancy. On the 20th of July, instead of talking about 5 things to get right, which is what we're talking about today, we're talking about 5 things to avoid. And then on the 21st of September, we're then covering collective redundancies, which is always that slightly awkward, oh, can I use batching? What happens? What about meaningful? What about establishment tests? All that sort of stuff. So exciting things. So today, we're going to be talking about pooling, selection criteria, consultation, dismissal, giving notice, and appeal. Now, does that sound appealing, Kate?
It does, definitely.
Is that the last of the dad jokes today, Kate?
I suspect not.
That's because your session is full of dad jokes, right? And as you can see, Kate humours me brilliantly. Apologies, there might be some bad jokes coming up. Right, let's talk about pooling for a couple of seconds or minutes. So, are we talking about indoor, outdoor, heated, plunge pools? No, of course we're not. We're talking about when you need a pool to select or appoint individuals from in a redundancy situation. But let's pause for a second. If I've got Fred or Ginger and they are in a unique role, the role they do is only undertaken by them, do we need a pool? No, of course we don't need a pool. Or you could say it's a pool of one, but a pool implies a number of people which you need to reduce. And if it's only one person, you don't need to apply a pooling process. So let's get rid of that if it's a pool of one. So let's assume it's a pool of more than one. If I've got 10 widget makers and I need to reduce down to 5 widget makers, then I'm going to apply selection criteria. Kate's going to talk about that in a second, to reduce that pool from 10 to 5. If in fact I've got my 10 widget makers, but I don't need 10 widget makers anymore, I need 10 what's it makers because it's a completely new role, I'm not going to apply selection criteria because I'm not going to reduce the original 10. I'm going to apply appointment criteria. So it's a different type of process, but it's essentially the same thing. I'm reducing that, and then over here I'm appointing over here, or I'm reducing my 10 down to 5. Now, who is in the pool? Is it everybody who has the same job title? Our survey would say, that's another cultural reference, which I'm hoping I got a smile from Kate on that one. Is it everybody who perhaps covers each other when someone's on holiday or go off sick? Well, maybe. Or is it fundamentally everybody who does the same job, irrespective of their job title? Answer, yes. I don't care really about whether your job title says you are this or says you are that. Fundamentally, if you're doing the same role, you are or should be placed in a pool together. Sometimes it comes a bit sensitive when you've got a manager who actually does fundamentally the same as the more junior person in the reporting line, but they, in theory, have management responsibility. In practice, do they have management responsibility? But putting the manager in with the more junior people can be, as I say, sensitive. So if we've got our pool, because we've got the pool of fundamentally the people who do that job the same, that should determine whether it's a big pool or a small pool, but sometimes you get issues with that. So if I were to take Mills and Reeve, and where I would say there's a solicitor in the employment team and there's a solicitor in the property team, they both fundamentally do the same thing, which is advise on the law, but they do very different things, don't they? One is advising on employment law and one is advising on property law. So they're not doing fundamentally the same thing. So when it comes to how big or how small your pool should be, then you're looking at, if you go too big, you are unsettling a large group of people. And you may be open to the argument from Fred or Ginger, who will say, well, had you not put those people over here at risk and put them through the process, I wouldn't have made redundant. But equally, if you go too small, then Fred or Ginger may say, well, you should have put those people at risk of redundancy because actually they are a worse performer than me and would have scored lower in the selection criteria process. On balance, probably better to go larger rather than smaller, but you've always got to balance the risk of those types of arguments and also putting more people through the churn unnecessarily. But if you can get it right as being the people who do fundamentally the same thing, you're in a good position. I'm going to thank you for the questions that have come in. I'm going to take questions at the end and we'll do it that way. Kate.
Yes, so selection criteria as tip number 2 to get right with redundancy. So selection criteria is also fundamental to the fairness of any redundancy dismissal. It has to be objective. We obviously can't emphasize that enough on this slide. What we mean by that is it has to be capable of being independently verified. And so we say on there, look in the whites of the eyes of the employee and be able to explain that criteria and how they've been scored and why they've been scored in relation to it. So that criteria has to be objective and therefore it has to be measurable and not based just on somebody's opinion of somebody within that particular pool, don't like them or don't think they're a particularly good performer. That's all going to be subjective based on opinion rather than this concept of having an objective criteria. So potentially fair criteria, your best positioning with that is going to be basing it on things where you've already got the documentation to back up the particular score. So it may be that you've got appraisals or performance documentation. You may have absence records held within HR. You may have documentation around somebody's particular skills or qualifications. So if you're in a logistics industry and you've got a group of people who can drive HGVs, a group of people who can drive Class 1 vans, that may form part of objective criteria depending on where you're trying to get to with a potential redundancy or restructure. So those are all things that are capable of that independent verification. We've said on the slide LIFO, for those that don't know what that means is last in, first out. And it used to be quite a common selection criteria to say, we've got a redundancy, we'll dismiss all the newer starters. We'll just take everybody who was last in through the door. They can be first to go in any redundancy situation. That is now a pretty blunt instrument. Tribunals and therefore the law doesn't like it. And the simple reason for that is your last in people, by and large, are probably going to be your younger workers who have just started in their career, and therefore your older workers are the ones that are automatically then kept in any redundancy situation. And so it's just not fair. It's not objective. It's not seen as something that is helpful in that situation. The only scenarios where we do tend to see it used is perhaps in a tie-break situation where you may have people who are scoring exactly the same score, and so you may then go and look at their length of service and who was last in the door to decide they're the ones to go. But otherwise, by and large, not a good one to rely upon. You can attach weightings to that criteria. So we have, in some examples, seen things like skills or future potential, for example, used as selection criteria. James and I don't like future potential, neither do a lot of tribunals, because it's very subjective. How am I to decide as a manager scoring people or using that selection criteria who has particular potential going forward over another? But where we have seen it used is where that potential, future potential as a selection criteria, albeit more subjective, is then given a perhaps a lower weighting than something that's more tangible, like an appraisal, where that appraisal may have happened 6 months ago, the employee hasn't challenged it at the time, and so it's a physical, tangible number that is fair across the board for everybody within that particular pool. Things to be mindful of if you are using performance as a criteria is who actually measured those employees at the time. Was it the same manager? Because actually this pool that James has just spoken about is a particular team managed by one person who did everybody's appraisals and therefore is relatively objective. Or actually has that team been scored in their appraisals by different managers? And so there's an element of subjectivity in terms of that scoring. And so what that means for your selection criteria and your scoring exercise is just having that assessment of it and deciding, actually, we can see that somebody scored something in their appraisal that's vastly different to somebody else. Do we just understand how that came about? So now applying this selection criteria and bringing it back to looking in the whites of the eyes of the employee, you can say, we have been fair. The selection criteria is objective, quantifiable, measurable, and we can see that we've applied that fairly. Things like capability, absence are also used. Goes without saying, be mindful where those absences might arise because of a disability, and considering whether, again, different weighting needs to be applied to that particular criteria to make sure that there's no discrimination.
There was a flurry of questions about absence as a criteria, and you've already just answered that. Thank you very much. Well done. Consultation. So I'm not talking about collective consultation, just from so sub 20 proposed dismissal consultation process. So although it's not collective consultation, I always think it's better to go in with a proposal. So where it's not collective consultation, we don't have to consult on whether we should implement the redundancies, and really it's about how we implement the redundancies. I much prefer to go with the proposal of should we, and you are starting off on therefore a more open basis, let me put it that way. So you are going to the employees and you're consulting on the proposed headcount reduction of some sort, and you're going on an open and transparent basis. This is the business case, these are the reasons why. I would say you are consulting on, therefore, on the selection criteria. Always good to share the selection criteria with the at-risk employees, because you may get some questions about it, and if you do and you are going to say no, as ever, it's no with reasons. Really important, rather than just going no. You take what we've given you. Reasons is always really important. So if you are consulting on the proposal, you're consulting on the criteria, you're obviously also consulting on alternative employment and the points about that group wide, looking at, can you offer, or do you want to just say here's the vacancy list? And then obviously seeking any alternative proposals from the at-risk employees to see if you can avoid the redundancy in the first place. I can't emphasize enough, though, as my last point, consultation here is with an open mind. So if somebody says, well, actually, I could job share my role, I could do different hours, we can cut costs in a different way and therefore keep their role, it's coming in and saying, well, actually, yes, this is great, or no, but these are the reasons why. So poor consultation leads to a poor dismissal, may lead to an unfair dismissal claim. So always consult fairly. Kate.
Good stuff. So moving on to number 4, getting the dismissal right effectively. You've been through this process and decided who's actually going to be made redundant. So there's a number of options in terms of how you bring about that termination. So you could pay people in lieu of notice. The contract may allow you to do that. And so you can effectively have them leave tomorrow and you pay them in lieu of their 3-month notice period, whatever it might be. The thing to be mindful of with paying in lieu of notice is whether you actually have the contractual right to do that. Because if you don't, then technically you are acting in breach of contract by paying somebody in lieu. The risk with that is that you need to make sure you're paying them what they would be entitled to if they were therefore working their notice. But also if you've got people where perhaps you have restrictive covenants in their contract that you want to be able to rely upon, if you've paid them in lieu of notice and you didn't have the right to do so, that employee may then say, well, my restrictions I'm no longer bound by because you've breached my contract. So it's just worth bearing in mind that whilst we see pay in lieu of notice often readily used, and the attraction is you can have a bit of a cleaner and sooner clean slate. Your people are made redundant and out of the business, you can move on. It's just checking whether actually you have the right to do that and what the implications might be for you as a business in doing so if there isn't that contractual clause to pay in lieu. Garden leave we also see relied upon, where perhaps you want people to remain around if needed, but you don't want them in the business for various different reasons. It isn't always because of sort of protecting information that they may have had, or again, those restrictive covenants. It may be just so that other people who are remaining in the business can get to grips with just moving forward. And we see a bit of a mix of both. So sometimes we see people working part of their notice, being put on garden leave for part of their notice, then being paid in lieu of the rest. So there's various different options in terms of how to bring about that dismissal. There's no right or wrong. It really depends on what the business needs in terms of that restructure, that redundancy, whether that particular individual is somebody that you need to hang around for any sort of handover, and just understanding what your contractual mechanisms might be for paying in lieu of notice, putting somebody on garden leave, or asking somebody to work the entirety of or part of their notice. Obviously, you need to be mindful of their holiday pay and making sure that at whatever point you're asking them to leave, you've checked what holiday, depending on when your holiday year starts and ends and when they're leaving, what they may have accrued up until that point of termination, but also if you're paying them in lieu, whether actually they would have gone over a threshold in terms of any sort of accruing any more holiday, or if I skip down to redundancy pay, certainly if they've accrued any sort of next level in terms of their age criteria because they've had an anniversary in terms of years of service or their birthday, that may then impact sort of the statutory redundancy pay formula that you would then use. PEN is on there, or pay in lieu of post-employment notice pay. And this is effectively a rule that was introduced, I think, around 2018 now, which is basically a calculation. It's quite a complicated calculation, so I am not going to go into it today. But it's broadly checking that the basic salary the employee would have received if they had worked their notice has been properly accounted for, and calculating that any unworked notice that they've got reflects what their basic pay would have been during that period. And so where it sometimes catches employers out is where you've done a payment in lieu of notice calculation based just on basic pay, but had they worked their notice period, they may have had other things like some allowances are captured. So car allowance, for example, can be captured. And also if they've had any sort of salary sacrifice in place. And through that calculation of post-employment notice pay, you may find that that figure is higher than what you've paid them as payment in lieu of notice. And what that then means is if you've then paid them any sort of enhanced redundancy, it may be that part of that is taxable as that post and subject to national insurance contributions as that post-employment notice pay. So I think pre these rules, it used to be quite easy for an employer to say, right, we're going to pay you in lieu of notice of this amount, and your redundancy enhanced or otherwise is this amount. Post-employment notice pay is this extra calculation to check that actually you are approaching the tax treatment of those payments correctly. It is complicated. It's not something that we can do even in a 30-minute webinar if we devoted it just to PEMP, but it's worth just understanding that that is there if you are paying people in lieu or asking them not to work the entirety of their notice. And then very quickly around redundancy pay, as I say, you've got two options. You either pay statutory redundancy pay and therefore check when anniversaries fall and that they don't tip the balance in terms of a new age within that calculation period, or an anniversary in terms of years of service. Or you may well pay enhanced redundancy pay, which we see a lot of employers doing these days. And where you do that, even though you've listened to this webinar and so your redundancy process will be more than fair, if you're paying enhanced redundancy pay, consider whether you tie it up under a settlement agreement so that you've got that clean exit and, no misunderstanding in terms of what's being offered to the employee.
Thank you, Kate. Just to clarify, not that anything really needed clarifying, that if you are paying in lieu without the contractual right to do so, technically the employee has the right to the holiday they would have accrued had they worked their notice period. It's not the greatest of arguments, but we sometimes see it flowed back, and then when you have to make a calculation and increase the payment. But just to clarify. Right, last section, section 5 on appeal. So no more jokes about being appealing, obviously. In essence, in a redundancy situation, you really don't want to be in an appeal scenario. Why not? Well, because if you've gone through your redundancy process, you've worked out who is going and who is staying. If you're then going to go through an appeal, which obviously we need to, if the person does appeal, then you don't want to start unraveling things because scores may change. which goes back to the phrase we've been using a number of times in this, which is about whites of the eyes. Why do we keep going on about that? That's because if I'm sitting down with Fred or Ginger and I'm saying, you've scored this against this criteria and this against this criteria, I'm looking them in the whites of the eyes and explaining why, with all the reasons from the managers and the moderation and the whole process that we've gone through to get to that point. The reason you're doing that is to be transparent, but also you are reducing the likelihood of that person appealing, because they can understand why you've given them the score they've given them. But if notwithstanding there is an appeal, how are we going to deal with that? Well, the person who's hearing the appeal needs to be a peer or above the person who was the dismissing manager. Are you going to go through a full rehearing, or are you just going to deal with the appeal points raised? Now, I love Kate's reference that if you've listened to this webinar, your redundancy process will be perfect, but not every redundancy process is perfect. If there are procedural points that are being raised, your appeal is a chance to fix those procedural points and deal with those issues, and may avoid subsequent litigation. So on that, if you're in that scenario, you may well decide to do a complete rehearing. You wouldn't then do an appeal from there, but you would do a complete rehearing. If in fact you're comfortable with the process or procedural points are not being raised, you're just going to deal with those issues. But what you can't do, if you have going through the process, even before you get to any appeals, is say to anybody, you're definitely safe, because it's subject to appeals, because things may change on appeals. Scores may change, pools may change, things happen. So whilst it's very tempting sometimes to say, unfortunately, you've been selected for redundancy and therefore you're going to be made redundant because we can't find any alternative roles for you. And for these other people, you're fine because you scored above the line, for example, in a selection process, and therefore you're safe. You can't say you're safe. You have to qualify that by saying you've not been made redundant in this process, which is great, but it is subject to any appeal going through. That was our 5 things to get right in a redundancy process. We've just got 7 minutes. So what I propose to do is Kate and I go through some of your questions. We have 21 questions. If anybody has any more, please fire them through in the Q&A. If you don't want to hear the questions and just want to go, that is fine. A pop-up will appear with a feedback form. Please give us some love. In the time that we just lost Tina Turner, and we should spread some love in the world. That would be good to have. And we send our best wishes to all of you who are mourning the loss of Tina Turner. Right.
There's some interesting questions on selection criteria. I'm happy just to pick up on that. I've just been reading while you've been doing your last bit. Somebody asked a question around length of service, and actually if somebody has less than 2 years service and therefore can't bring an unfair dismissal claim, can't we just effectively use the ones that are to be made redundant? And they have caveated it by saying, let's assume they've got no protected characteristic. My only comment on that is, I suppose, 10, 15 years ago, we used to hear people in training say they've got no protected characteristics. They're a white, middle-aged man. Well, there's 3 protected characteristics already: white, middle-aged, and male. So I think this whole notion of they don't have a protected characteristic has gone. You know, everybody has a protected characteristic these days, because everybody will be able to identify with one of them, because everybody has an age, a gender identity. So it's just worth bearing in mind that, yes, you know, often we may ask those questions around, well, how much service have they got? And you can obviously balance and therefore assess the risk. If your whole pool is full of, you know, white middle-aged men or white middle-aged women, you may then say, well, okay, the ones with less than 2 years service, we know that there's no other protected characteristic at play, so we'll use their service. Then yes, you know, the risk there might be lower, but I think it's, yeah, don't automatically assume that because people don't have an obvious and visible protected characteristic that it might not be there, or that because everybody in that pool is of the same age or gender that isn't going to sort of be something to consider. The second question was just around who monitors the selection criteria and the scoring. It depends, you know, it depends on the number in the pool. It may be that you have one manager do everybody so it's objective. You may have a panel that actually do the scoring so that it can be sort of assessed and challenged to make sure that you've got that objectivity coming out at the end of it. Sometimes we see HR do sort of a final check of that, not always. But yeah, as the classic lawyer answer, I'm afraid it depends. It depends on your pool, it depends on your criteria, it depends how many people we're talking about.
Just to pick up another one on selection criteria question, can you use formal disciplinary action or performance process in the selection criteria? Absolutely. That's it. Provided that's been done right. We love those. They're very objective. I had a pooling question. Should geography be a consideration? To pick up Kate's phrase, it depends. If your need is for a number of workers in a certain location, that is going to be your pool, because that has to be done there, and those are the workers that work there. If it's as we're now living in a largely hybrid world in terms of where people can undertake the work, geography becomes far grayer in terms of being a consideration. So I think if it's legitimate, you need the people to be here, your pool will consist of those people there. If actually people can be doing the work from anywhere, it's much harder to say, that is my limiting pool. What's the next one, Kate?
Yeah, I'm just having a look. There's one around if somebody appeals, can you still make the redundancy payment and pay them in lieu of notice in the interim whilst the appeal is decided? Excuse me, I'm going to cough. Yes, the answer to that is yeah, you can, once the redundancy has been done, you can make the payments, and if they do appeal, then deal with the appeal. Depends on timing, really. If they appeal the day after, it may be that you want to think about sort of when you affect those payments, depending on how quickly you're going to push everything through. But there's no need to sort of hold off moving things forward whilst you deal with that appeal.
I love this one. It says it's not a question, but a great session with great presenters. So thank you for arranging. I look forward to attending more and listening to the recording. Many thanks. Sharing the love there. I do like that. I think there's been a number of questions about using absence as a fair selection criteria. I think you dealt with that in the session. If you're paying pylon, how do you approach that with someone who has variable pay? Variable pay is really complicated under the Employment Rights Act. Depends if you have no normal hours or not. Broad brush principle is you would undertake a averaging calculation, potentially over the last 12 weeks or longer, maybe over the last year, to look at what their average pay is. If you do that, you're including overtime and bonuses, and that will give you your pylon sum if the person has variable pay due to no normal hours.
James, I think we've got time for one last question, maybe. There's one that says, do you have any advice on handling a redundancy appeal which is upheld?
If you do, and you've done what I suggested earlier, and you haven't given anybody any guarantees, then you're going to have to go back and unravel what has happened. So, and if you like, there's no point of doing the appeal unless you are able to do that. So I would say if that person actually has raised issues, not at the consultation meetings, but in the appeal, and says, actually, you didn't take into account this when selecting me and applying my scoring, and that puts them in, above somebody else, then yes, that means that they're going to stay and somebody else is going to have to go. So you're going to have to go back through the resumption of the redundancy process for the individual who now scores below the line. Your appealing person is above the line, and you're going to have to be transparent about that and the reasons why. Okay, I think we perhaps need to call this to an end. There are some questions which we haven't answered, but if you've put your name on them, we can come back to you. If it was anonymous, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for us to reply to you. It leaves me to say, Kate, you were brilliant as ever. Thank you very much. I hope everybody enjoyed it. You won't see us again, but you'll see, hopefully, our colleagues on the next one in July about how to avoid getting 5 things wrong in redundancy. It's not quite called that, but it's something like that. Close enough. Thank you, everybody, and have a great Thursday. See you soon.
Bye. Bye all.